Much as the Audacious class were roughly the British equivalent of the Essex class, the Malta class would have been the approximate contemporary of the Midway class. The Audacious programme had been complemented by the Light Fleet Carrier programme in 1942, but it was realised larger ships were needed, and in 1943 detailed design work was started on the next generation of fleet carriers. So urgent was the perceived need that 4 ships, Malta, Gibraltar, Africa and New Zealand, were ordered in late 1943, with materials to be gathered as soon as possible, despite the final design not yet actually having been completed. The designs considered whether to stick with the enarmoured flight deck and enclosed hangar, the former for protection and the latter for a stronger and more efficient hull, or whether to save weight by eliminating the former and allow aircraft to be warmed up prior to being taken to the flight deck by adopting the American practice of open hangars. Design X, the first of the final designs, would come in at about 60,000 tonnes with an unarmoured flight deck but a very thickly armoured hangar deck, and with the forward part of the hangar enclosed but the aft section open. 2 centerline and 2 side lifts were included, with anti-aircraft armament being 16 4.5-inch guns in 8 twin mounts in pairs on each corner as per previous fleet carriers, but with more advanced, more agile mounts. A number of sextuple and single 40mm Bofors would also be installed. This option was actually a bit larger than the Midways, but would also be a bit too large for most of the Royal Navy's docks without expansion work being done to them, and so a slightly reduced design, X1, was prepared. These designs also represented a change in Royal Navy carrier design thinking. Previously, the carrier was built to what was thought to be the best balance of size and cost, and then aircraft specifications were issued to comply with that carrier's restrictions in terms of weight and dimensions. Whereas on the Maltas, a long-range strike aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds was envisaged as the primary component of her air group, and the carrier was then designed around the requirements of this theoretical aircraft. The X1 design was a fraction smaller, at 897 feet long, with a design speed of 33 knots via 4 shafts powered by 200,000 shaft horsepower. The hangar was, like the Audacious class, built to 17-foot 6-inch height, but unlike the preceding class, a single, larger 440-foot hangar was selected instead of a double hangar with slightly smaller total areas per level. The hangar could be divided into 4 sections by fireproof doors, with a lift serving each section. In theory, flight operations could continue if one section was burning but isolated. After the relative experiences of British and American carriers against kamikazes in 1945 became apparent, there was a push to go back to an armoured flight deck, but by this point it was considered that there was not enough time to redesign the ship again, as they'd already been delayed by the decision to move to a partially open hangar deck. Already Africa and Gibraltar, intended for laying down in 1944, were running behind schedule, but it was planned to lay down Malta and New Zealand in 1945, proceed with them, and then possibly revise the design of the first 2 ships a little bit later. Intended to operate 108 of the newer and larger aircraft, the whole class was nonetheless cancelled in late 1945 as part of austerity measures introduced at the end of the war, with the Admiralty agreeing, largely on the basis of the assumption that the Implacables, Illustriouses and Audaciouses could be modified relatively easily for the new age of jet aircraft and angled flight decks, since at the time some of these ships were barely a few years in service and others hadn't actually finished construction. It seemed to make sense to make do with what they had. As it turned out, the assumption was badly wrong. Low hangar heights in everything except the Audacious class, and even more rapid growth in the size of aircraft than had been anticipated, and the difficulty in adapting even the Audacious class to the new layout requirements owing to the extensive work that was needed to cut into the armoured decks and sides, meant that when the overall cost, efficiency and availability of the Royal Navy carrier fleet in the late 40s, 50s and 60s is considered, it's almost certain that a better, more capable and cheaper fleet could have been run by dropping all of the older designs and completing and running the Malta class instead. Due to the ongoing design work at the time of cancellation, and given the histories of the Audacious class under construction, and the very likely complete reworking of Gibraltar and Africa that would have taken place, The capabilities of the design reflected in the X1 parameters can only really be taken as approximately indicative. Nonetheless, had they been built, their size and longevity, as well as lower operational costs, would probably have meant no CVA-01 program in the 1960s and most likely the retention of a Royal Navy fixed-wing carrier asset continuously into the 1980s, which does have some interesting implications for one particular conflict in 1982, but alas, we shall never know.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.